was a quiet June morning in Idaho. Detectives stood in a freshly dug patch of soil behind a small farmhouse in Rexburg, shovels in hand, silence hanging in the air. Within minutes, the first officer froze. What they uncovered wasn't just earth. It was the unthinkable. 2 shallow graves. 2 small bodies. The remains of Tylee Ryan, just 16, and her little brother J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, children who had been missing for nearly a year. As the news spread, the world learned a name it would never forget: Lori Vallow Daybell, the self-proclaimed Doomsday Mom. To neighbors, she'd once seemed like a loving mother, devoted to her faith. But behind her smile lay a chilling obsession with the end of the world, with spirits and prophecies, and with a man who called himself a modern prophet, Chad Daybell. Together, they built a twisted belief system, one that mixed religion, apocalypse, and death. And before it was over, 5 people connected to them would end up dead. As the graves were uncovered that summer morning, investigators finally saw the truth. This wasn't just another missing person case. It was the story of how love, greed, and delusion created one of the most shocking family murders in modern American history. Because for Lori and Chad, the end of the world had already begun. Long before the world knew her as the Doomsday Mom, Lori Noreen Vallow was simply a bright, outgoing girl from California. Born in 1973, she grew up in a large family and was raised with strong Mormon beliefs. Those who knew her described her as charming, the kind of woman who could light up any room. But underneath that perfect smile, Lori carried a hunger for excitement and purpose. She often spoke about destiny, divine calling, and the battle between good and evil, themes that would later consume her life. Lori married young, and by her 30s, she had already been through multiple marriages. Her relationships seemed passionate but chaotic, each one leaving a trail of conflict and instability. Her third husband, Joseph Ryan, was the father of her daughter, Tylee. Their relationship ended in bitterness, and Joseph later accused Lori of keeping their daughter away from him. Years later, he would die suddenly from what was ruled a heart attack, though some family members would always doubt that conclusion. By 2006, Lori had remarried again, this time to Charles Vallow, a kind, patient man from Texas who adored her and treated Tylee as his own daughter. Together, they adopted a baby boy named Joshua J.J. Vallow, a sweet child with autism who quickly became the light of their lives. For a time, their home was peaceful. Friends described them as the perfect family, loving, close-knit, and spiritual. But slowly, Lori began to change. She became obsessed with the end times, spending hours reading obscure religious texts and online prophecies. She started to believe that she had a divine mission, that she was chosen by God to prepare for the second coming. Around the same time in rural Idaho, Chad Daybell was living a very different yet strangely similar life. Born in 1968, Chad had grown up surrounded by faith. He was a quiet, introspective man who loved writing and believed deeply in the afterlife. He worked as a cemetery sexton, someone who digs graves, and said he often felt close to the spirit world. He wrote dozens of self-published books about prophecy, near-death experiences, and the apocalypse. His followers saw him as a visionary. He spoke of visions, portals to other worlds, and spirits who could inhabit human bodies. In his world, good and evil were not just ideas, they were literal forces walking among us. By 2018, both Lori and Chad were living separate lives, but fate was about to bring them together at a religious conference in St. George, Utah. Witnesses say their connection was instant. Chad told Lori they had been married in multiple past lives. He said she was an eternal being, a goddess sent to help him gather the chosen ones for the end of days. Lori believed him. From that moment, her life began to unravel. She started to withdraw from her family and friends, telling them she had been called to a higher purpose. Charles, her husband, grew terrified as her beliefs deepened. He confided in police that Lori told him he was already dead, replaced by a dark spirit. He didn't know it yet, but that belief, that some people were dark or possessed by evil, would soon justify murder in Lori's mind. By 2019, the once happy Vallow household had turned into something unrecognizable, filled with secret rituals, coded messages, and whispers about the end of the world. And in the middle of it all were two children, Tylee and JJJ, too young to understand that the danger wasn't coming from outside. It was living right inside their home. By 2019, Lori Vallow's world had completely split in two, one foot still in reality, and the other lost inside visions of a coming apocalypse. To her family, it looked like she was drifting away. To Lori, she was finally waking up. She told friends that angels spoke to her at night, that she was a translated being, chosen by God to lead the 144,000, a sacred army meant to survive the end of the world. She believed she could see who was light and who was dark, who was human, and who had already been taken over by evil spirits. Her husband, Charles Vallow, watched helplessly as the woman he loved disappeared into delusion. He told police that Lori had called him a zombie, a soulless shell, possessed by darkness. He begged for intervention, saying, "I'm afraid for my life." When officers met Lori, she smiled serenely and said Charles was the one who'd lost his mind. She told them she was fine, that she was busy doing the Lord's work. Her calmness was disarming, her confidence chilling. In February, she vanished for nearly 2 months. When she returned, she was distant, distracted, and cold. She told her children that things were changing and that the world was almost over. Then, in July 2019, everything shattered. Police in Chandler, Arizona, responded to a 911 call from Lori's home. Inside, they found Charles Vallow dead, shot twice in the chest by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Alex claimed Charles had attacked him with a baseball bat and that he fired in self-defense. But detectives found the scene strange. The bat was too far from the body. The blood splatter didn't match the story, and Lori's behavior was eerily calm. She was seen laughing with neighbors that same afternoon and hosting a pool party the next day. For investigators, something felt deeply off, but with no witnesses and Alex's self-defense claim, the case was left unresolved. To outsiders, Charles's death seemed sudden, but to Lori and Chad, it was just the plan. Chad had already told Lori that Charles was a dark spirit, and his death was God's will. Within weeks, Lori moved from Arizona to Rexburg, Idaho, where Chad Daybell lived. Friends thought it was sudden, family thought it was suspicious, but for Lori, it was destiny. She told one friend, "My mission is finally aligning." Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, began noticing her husband's strange behavior. He was distracted, constantly messaging a woman named Lori. He started speaking openly about death, about how people's spirits could leave their bodies before dying, and how some souls were already dark. Then, in early October, Tammy posted on Facebook that a masked man had tried to shoot her in her driveway. She thought it was a prank, until just 10 days later, she was found dead in her bed. Chad told police she'd gone to sleep coughing and never woke up. There was no autopsy. The cause of death was listed as natural. Within 2 weeks, he married Lori Vallow on a beach in Hawaii. Photos from that wedding showed a smiling couple surrounded by tropical flowers. But beneath the sunlight and sand, something sinister was hiding. Back in Idaho, neighbors noticed something. Lori's 2 children, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, had vanished. Tylee, just 16, had last been seen at Yellowstone National Park on September 8, 2019, during a family trip. Photos from that day show her standing stiffly, expression blank, her last known picture alive. JJJ, only 7, was last seen a few days later at his new school in Rexburg. On September 23rd, his teachers remembered him playing with friends. The next day, he was gone. Lori had withdrawn him from school, saying she was homeschooling him. After that, silence. Weeks passed. No one saw or heard from the kids again. Lori gave conflicting stories to everyone who asked, telling one friend that Tylee was at college, another that JJ was with his grandparents, and yet another that they were safe and happy. But by November 2019, those stories began to crumble. Police tried to perform a welfare check after JJ's grandparents raised alarms. When they arrived at Lori's townhouse in Rexburg, she smiled politely and said the kids were with a friend in Arizona. That friend denied everything. Within days, Lori and Chad packed up and vanished again, abandoning their home, their belongings, and any trace of the children. Authorities issued a missing person alert. Posters of Tylee and JJ began appearing across Idaho, Arizona, and Utah. Their faces, one teenage girl, one little boy, became the center of a growing national obsession. When reporters tracked Lori and Chad down in Hawaii 2 months later, they confronted them in a resort parking lot. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward. One reporter asked, "Where are your children?" Lori just smiled. Her silence was louder than any answer she could have given. That image, Lori Vallow, dressed in white, walking hand in hand with Chad, became the defining symbol of the case. Because while she posed in paradise, hundreds of miles away, in the frozen soil of Idaho, 2 young bodies were waiting to be found. By the end of 2019, the story of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had become something out of a nightmare. A missing mother, 2 vanished children, and a trail of mysterious deaths that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Police in Rexburg, Idaho, were now fully involved. They began digging into the strange beliefs that Lori and Chad shared, beliefs that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism. Detectives uncovered emails, text messages, and journals that painted a chilling picture. Lori and Chad truly believed they were living in the final days before the end of the world. They called themselves warriors of light, chosen by God to gather the 144,000 souls who would survive the apocalypse. In their world, everyone was labeled either light or dark, a simple system with deadly consequences. If someone was dark, Lori and Chad believed their body had already been taken over by an evil spirit, and in their minds, a dark spirit couldn't be saved. It could only be cast out. Those dark spirits started to appear suspiciously close to home. First, Charles Vallow, Lori's husband, was labeled dark. Then, her daughter Tylee. Soon after, even her son JJ. Through recovered texts, investigators learned that Chad had given every person a rating, numbers measuring how spiritually light or dark they were. In one message, Lori asked if her kids' spirits were still in their bodies. Chad replied, "No, they've been replaced." It wasn't religion anymore. It was control. The FBI joined the search, pulling phone data, location records, and financial transactions. They discovered that Tylee's phone had been active for days after she supposedly disappeared, but only for a few texts to Lori's contacts, all worded strangely, as if written by someone else. The texts stopped abruptly on September 9, 2019. The same morning, Chad Daybell's neighbor reported seeing a large bonfire burning on his property. As investigators built their timeline, more bizarre behavior came to light. Lori and Chad had been hosting secret gatherings, telling a small circle of followers that they could cast out demons, identify zombies, and prepare the chosen for the final battle. Some of those followers later told police that Lori and Chad spoke casually about death, as if it were a form of salvation. They said Chad believed he could communicate with spirits from other realms, even his own dead relatives, who supposedly gave him messages from beyond. The pair's confidence only grew after Tammy Daybell's sudden death. Chad publicly claimed she had died peacefully in her sleep, but privately, he told followers that Tammy's body had been possessed by a dark entity. Just days later, he married Lori in Hawaii. They spent their honeymoon surrounded by waves and laughter, as if the world's judgment couldn't touch them. Meanwhile, back in Idaho, the Cox and Ryan families were desperately begging for answers. Tylee's friends hadn't heard from her in months. JJ's grandparents hadn't seen him since summer. They kept calling, emailing, pleading, but Lori ignored them all. In December 2019, police officially declared the children missing. The investigation intensified. Search warrants were executed in Idaho, Arizona, and Utah. They found something deeply unsettling: a storage unit rented by Lori in Rexburg. Inside were the kids' toys, bikes, photo albums, and clothes. Everything that made them real, abandoned like they never existed. As 2020 began, investigators focused on Chad Daybell. They tracked his phone records and found that on the morning of September 9th, just hours after Tylee was last seen, his phone pinged multiple times in a small area behind his house near the barn, the same location where neighbors had seen smoke. When questioned, Chad said he'd been burning tree branches. But detectives weren't convinced. His answers were vague, his memory selective. It was only when police finally turned their attention to Chad's property months later that the horrifying truth was uncovered. Because beneath the soil of Chad Daybell's peaceful backyard, the same ground where he'd buried pets, tended gardens, and preached of heaven, something unholy was waiting to be found. It was June 9th, 2020. The morning sun hung low over Rexburg, Idaho, as investigators quietly stepped onto Chad Daybell's property. This time, they had a warrant, new phone data, and one final lead. Behind the red barn, detectives noticed uneven ground, patches of disturbed soil. One officer pressed his glove into the dirt. It was softer than it should have been. Minutes later, they began to dig. The silence broke when a shovel hit something wrapped in black plastic and bound with duct tape. Moments later, the FBI confirmed everyone's worst fear: the remains of Joshua J.J. Vallow, Lori's 7-year-old son. He'd been buried behind the barn, hidden like he never mattered. Just a few yards away, in another shallow grave, they found Tylee Ryan, 16, her remains burned and dismembered in an area Chad once called his pet cemetery. Even seasoned officers were shaken. One said, "It felt like grief had a weight." For 9 months, people had hoped the children were alive. Now that hope was gone. When police arrested Chad, he didn't resist. Sitting calmly in his car, he whispered, "You've found them, haven't you?" Lori, already in custody, showed no emotion when told. She told her cellmate the kids were in a better place, part of God's plan. For prosecutors, this was no longer a missing person case. It was murder. Investigators pieced together the events of September 2019. Tylee was likely killed first, the same day Chad texted his wife Tammy, "I've had a busy morning. I buried a raccoon in the pet cemetery." That message matched the exact spot where Tylee's remains were found. Days later, around September 22nd, JJ was believed to have been killed. Chad's phone pinged near the same location. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, who had killed her husband Charles Vallow, was also tied to the site, but before he could be questioned, he was found dead that December. By summer 2020, Lori and Chad were charged with murder, conspiracy, and evidence destruction. Their followers, once believers in their divine mission, now watched in disbelief. Prosecutors revealed both had collected life insurance and Social Security benefits after the deaths of their spouses and children. It wasn't faith, it was delusion and greed. Lori appeared emotionless in court, smiling at times. Chad sat pale and silent, trapped in the fantasy he'd created. When the evidence was shown, the photos, texts, and location data, there was no denying it. They hadn't been preparing for the end of the world. They had created their own. Outside the courthouse, candles flickered beside photos of Tylee and JJ, two innocent souls lost to a nightmare called faith. By 2021, the world knew their names: Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, the so-called Doomsday couple. They claimed to be chosen by God, but now stood accused of murdering Lori's children and Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell. In the Idaho courtroom, reporters filled every seat. Cameras lined the halls as people nationwide tuned in to watch justice unfold. Lori entered smiling, blonde hair curled, calm and radiant. She didn't look like a mother accused of killing her own children. She looked lost in her delusion. Prosecutors built a chilling case with phone data, messages, financial records, and lies that tied Lori and Chad to every disappearance. They read Chad's message to Lori days before the children vanished. "The time is close. The plan is in motion." Jurors heard about the light and dark scale, the so-called zombie ratings deciding who lived or died. They learned of the insurance policies, secret affairs, and Lori's cold precision as she erased everyone in her path: her husband, her children, and Chad's wife. When photos of the backyard graves appeared, the courtroom went silent. Even the defense looked away. Lori never flinched. She claimed she was guided by a higher power, that her children were happy and free in heaven. But the jury saw no faith, only premeditation, manipulation, and greed. After 6 weeks and 60 witnesses, in May 2023, Lori was found guilty of murdering Tylee Ryan, JJ Vallow, and Tammy Daybell. She didn't cry, just stood quietly, smiling faintly as if she expected it. In July 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge called her crimes heinous and cold-blooded, fueled by twisted spirituality. Even then, Lori refused accountability, saying her children were busy in the afterlife, doing great things. Chad's trial followed in 2024. His followers were gone. The self-proclaimed prophet now sat pale and trembling as prosecutors exposed his lies, how he manipulated, murdered, and profited in the name of prophecy. Tammy's exhumed autopsy proved she'd been asphyxiated. Her death, no accident. Evidence showed Chad buried the children, lied to police, collected insurance, and married Lori weeks after Tammy's death. Prosecutors said, "This isn't faith, it's control, not prophecy, but premeditated murder." The jury agreed. In June 2024, Chad was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He whispered, "It's in God's hands now." For the victims' families, it was justice, but not peace. Because even with Lori behind bars and Chad on death row, one question remains: how did faith turn into delusion, and belief into a weapon? After the verdicts, Rexburg tried to return to normal, but nothing about this story ever truly faded. For months, people drove past the Daybell property, leaving flowers by the fence where 2 small crosses still stood. The quiet town that once knew peace had become a symbol of faith, gone wrong. Inside prison walls, Lori remained unshaken. Guards said she smiled often, telling other inmates she'd soon see her children again. She spent hours writing scriptures and claimed angels visited her cell. Chad, meanwhile, sat in near silence on death row, his self-published books now removed from stores, his followers gone. Across Idaho and Arizona, families of the victims tried to rebuild their lives. JJ's grandparents became advocates for stronger protections for children in custody disputes. Tylee's friends held annual vigils, reading her favorite quotes and playing the same music she once danced to. The case also changed how investigators approached faith-based crimes. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize warning signs of spiritual delusion, teachings that blur morality and justify harm. Reporters called it the Doomsday Effect, a modern reminder that belief, when twisted by obsession, can destroy everything it touches. Even years later, the fascination hasn't faded. Documentaries, podcasts, and TV series continue to dissect how two ordinary people convinced themselves they were divine. But for the families left behind, there's no mystery left. Only the memory of two children who should have grown up, gone to school, and lived full lives. Looking back, the story of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell isn't just about murder. It's about control, illusion, and the human need to find meaning in chaos. How two people, once described as loving and faithful, could twist belief into justification for killing. It still haunts those who followed the case. Some questions may never be answered. No one truly knows what happened inside Lori's mind in those final days, whether she believed her own visions or simply hid behind them. And Chad's silence leaves the deepest void of all. Did he ever feel remorse, or did he go to his cell still convinced that the world was ending? What remains are fragments, phone messages, burnt soil, courtroom testimony, traces of a story where every line between devotion and delusion was erased. Because in the end, the Doomsday Murders weren't about prophecy or destiny. They were about people, human, fragile, and lost, who mistook destruction for salvation.